Tanya Smith Evans, and I'd like to welcome you to the NFC, which is the nonprofit fundraising channel.
And I'm Kurt Wheaton with Tanya to discuss a very important topic, one that often determines whether a nonprofit organization gets a charitable gift or not. We're going to take a close look at how nonprofits calculate and report what's called an overhead ratio.
In my experience, that ratio is really important for some funders and even some foundations. And then apparently for others, it doesn't seem to be that important.
In most instances, overhead is considered to be the sum of a nonprofit's administrative and its fundraising costs, plus some related expenses as well. Now, when it comes to overhead as a percent or ratio of a nonprofit's total expenses or revenue, that ratio is controversial. Some argue that overhead ratio gets way too much attention on the part of funders. And others feel, though, that overhead is a good barometer for measuring the effectiveness of a nonprofit.
And what's your personal opinion, Kurt?
Well, most thoughtful funders, including, I would say, many foundations, agree that overhead is an integral part of any organization's operations. It's relatively easy to figure out a nonprofit's overhead by looking at an organization's Form 990. Now, this is the financial report that most nonprofits file annually with the government. If you go to page 10 of that report, you'll see a nonprofit's accounting of expenses. Now, this frame points out how columns C and D break out administrative and fundraising costs. Now, the sum of these two columns matched against an organization's total expenses gives us the nonprofit's overhead percentage or its ratio.
Got it.
My recommendation to most nonprofits is to try to keep an overhead ratio somewhere between 10 and 35% of total expenses. And by doing so, foundations and other funders will be less likely to challenge the financials included in a grant proposal. Now, at the start of this NFC Moneymaker, I made the point that overhead ratio is really, really important, and here's why. Many individuals, as well as some foundations and corporations, use monitoring sites like Charity Navigator, Wise Giving, or GuideStar to do a quick analysis of a nonprofit organization before a decision is made as to whether or not a donation should go to a nonprofit. Now, as a key factor, and in many cases the single most important factor in making a funding decision, is how much a nonprofit spends on administrative and fundraising compared to how much money goes directly to funding programs. In other words, what is a nonprofit's overhead ratio? So that brings us to NFC's takeaways for this Moneymaker presentation. First, make sure your organization's accounting practices are working in your favor. Don't record expenses as administrative or fundraising costs if they are directly linked in carrying out a program or activity. And second, unless your organization is in a startup mode, try keeping your overhead ratio between 10 and 35% of total expenses. And finally, remember that whether it's fair or not, many prospective contributors use your overhead ratio in deciding whether to make a donation to your organization or not. So consider carefully how you calculate and report overhead ratio.
Thanks again, Kurt, and thanks to our viewers.
And thanks to you, Tanya. Want more fundraising ideas? Well, click the subscribe icon and we'll link you to other NFC 5-minute nonprofit money-making strategies. On behalf of Tanya and myself, thanks for watching.